World War II began and ended in the Pacific, marked by some of the most brutal events in our history. It started with Japan's ruthless campaign in China and ended with the only use of nuclear bombs in warfare, all the while being accompanied by events so horrific that words can hardly describe them, haunting us to this day. The Pacific Theater was a completely different type of warfare that Allied soldiers encountered. It was also one of the most brutal fronts of World War II, marked by horrific events and millions of casualties, with battles fought on land, sea, underwater, and in the air. Today, we will discuss why the Pacific was possibly the worst front of World War II, posing the question of how human beings are capable of such truly dark things. Let's start by noting that the battles in the Pacific were fought on the opposite side of the world from the European theater, and all conventional warfare tactics were rendered useless. The soldiers encountered something they had never seen before. It all began with the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 and Japan's brutal campaign in China, followed by some truly indescribable atrocities and crimes. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor, which quickly drew the United States into the war, and the Pacific Theater was raging in full force. Let's begin with the land combat. Before even reaching the shore and beginning the brutal island-hopping battles against a well-fortified and prepared Japanese army, the Allied forces had to carry out a series of beach landings. Similar to the infamous Omaha landings in Normandy, the Pacific also witnessed some of the most deadly beach landings, such as the Tarawa landing, where unexpectedly shallow water and coral reefs trapped the landing craft, forcing the Marines to wade slowly through chest-deep water towards the beach, all the while under heavy enemy fire. Casualties were in the thousands on both sides. The Japanese were merciless in battle and rarely surrendered, desperately trying to inflict as much damage as possible on the enemy. When the situation became hopeless for them, it often ended in a banzai charge, where most of them would die, but not before inflicting heavy losses on the Allies. In the early stages, Japanese defensive tactics were characterized by immediate and fierce resistance at the beaches, but later they devised a more cunning and deadly tactic. They would let the Allies land without any resistance, even allowing them to take the beach and positions on the ground. Confused, Allied Marines would advance cautiously, thinking that perhaps there was no one on the island. However, the Japanese army had everything already prepared: artillery, machine guns, snipers, booby traps, and counterattacks when least expected. Instead of waiting exposed in open areas, the Japanese had constructed extensive systems of tunnels, trenches, and bunkers to protect themselves from Allied bombardment. Once the Allies were off the beaches and less supported by their naval firepower, the Japanese would launch ambushes and counterattacks, exploiting their intimate knowledge of the terrain. The battle would then turn into a protracted and bloody fight, with the Japanese making full use of their fortified positions and tunnels. The fighting was extremely close and brutal, with both sides suffering enormous casualties. The Japanese used various tactics to inflict losses on the Allies, often successfully, forcing them to pay with blood for every inch of captured land. On the other hand, the Allies were no less ruthless, employing relentless bombardments, flamethrowers, white phosphorus, napalm, and other horrific weapons. Not only was the land combat a massacre for both sides, but the battles were also fought in unbearable conditions, with extremely high temperatures and humidity. Maintaining communication and supply lines for the forces was difficult. Water was never sufficient, and evacuating the wounded was extremely challenging. For the Japanese, the situation was even worse. Cut off from the mainland and any supply or reinforcements, they were literally left to resist until death and delay the inevitable Allied invasion as much as possible. Even before the Allied invasion, it is estimated that the Japanese lost approximately the same number of soldiers due to disease and starvation as in combat. Left on an island with nowhere to go, they were to die for their emperor. Another dark aspect of the brutal island battles was that there were almost no prisoners taken on either side. fanatical Japanese soldiers would mostly fight to the end, convinced that the Allies were monsters and believing various stories about what would happen to them if captured alive. However, even for those who did surrender, the situation was horrific. First, Japanese soldiers would often stage fake surrenders, raising white flags only to get close enough to detonate bombs or explosives or to expose Allied soldiers. There was even an incident where a wounded, captured Japanese soldier grabbed a scalpel from a medic trying to save his life and stabbed him, while another shot a sailor who tried to offer him a cup of coffee, thinking he was no longer a threat. This led to such mutual hatred that soldiers who genuinely surrendered were often shot on the spot. Another factor in the Japanese surrender was that the battles on the islands were fought chaotically, without a clear line between enemies, and taking a captured soldier back to the rear across the entire island was extremely dangerous for the Allies, so they often couldn't take prisoners. As for the Allied soldiers captured by the Japanese, they endured some of the worst fates imaginable. Downed airmen or crews of sunken ships would experience true hell in Japanese captivity, and thousands would not live to see the end of the war. Camps, forced labor, death marches, executions, and even cannibalism occurred. Allied prisoners of war were transported in the most inhumane ways possible, deep within overloaded Japanese ships without water or food, locked in brutal and unbearable conditions, without light or fresh air for days. These ships were later named Hell ships, and unfortunately, many were sunk by the Allies who were unaware that they were carrying thousands of prisoners of war. In addition to the relentless land battles, there were also aerial battles that were equally terrifying. The aerial battles of the Pacific Theater were marked by fierce dogfights, bombing raids, and the desperate courage of both Allied and Japanese airmen and seamen. Japanese aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M-0, was a highly maneuverable fighter that outclassed most Allied aircraft in the early stages of the conflict. Japanese pilots, many of whom were veterans of the Sino-Japanese War, were well trained and experienced, giving them a significant advantage in the initial battles. However, as the war progressed, the balance of power began to shift. As Japan began to lose its grip, the nature of aerial combat took on a more desperate and deadly turn. The Japanese military, facing overwhelming odds and dwindling resources, resorted to kamikaze attacks, trying in every way to cause as much damage as possible to the Allies. These attacks were carried out in the hundreds, forcing the Allies to perfect their anti-aircraft defenses. In addition to aerial battles, Allied strategic bombings of Japan were merciless. As Allied forces closed in on Japan, the focus shifted to bombing the Japanese mainland itself. The United States Army Air Forces deployed long-range bombers like the B-29 Superfortress to carry out devastating raids on Japanese cities and industrial centers. They unleashed destruction on a scale previously unseen in warfare, such as the firebombing of Tokyo. Over 300 B-29 bombers dropped incendiary bombs on the city, creating a massive firestorm that killed an estimated 100,000 people and left much of the city in ruins. This was part of a campaign to break Japan's will to fight by targeting its industrial capacity and civilian population, and it would end in the most horrific way possible. Yes, the atomic bombs. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped the first bomb, codenamed Little Boy, on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The effects of the two atomic bombs on cities full of people are beyond description. In the direct impact, approximately 200,000 people lost their lives, with thousands of survivors experiencing various brutal consequences of radiation for decades after the war. Just a few days after the atomic bombs, Japan finally officially surrendered, but not before yet another lesser-known dark chapter unfolded. Propaganda had convinced the Japanese population that the Allies were inhuman criminals who would do unspeakable things to any Japanese who surrendered, and that it was better not to live to see it. We should not describe it in detail, But this led to thousands of tragic stories where entire families disappeared together, and even family members helped each other in this, if you understand what I mean. Thus ended the deadliest conflict in human history, brutally, with the loss of life of thousands of people who did not choose war, exactly the same as it had started.